Hello and welcome to this week's TES News podcast. You'll have to bear with me today. My name is William Stewart. I'm the TES News editor and I'm standing in for our usual experienced host, Dave Speck. So today I've got still got a good team to do it with me. We've got Mary Louise Clues, our deputy news editor. Hello, Mary Louise.
Hi.
We've got reporter John Roberts. Hi, John.
Hello.
And we've got Amy Gibbons. Hi, Amy.
Hello.
So we're not short of things to talk about today. I've been saying on Twitter how proud I am of all the investigations and exclusives we've got. So we'll dive straight in. I think the first one links into what's going on more widely in the country at the moment. Obviously, yesterday we heard that about half the country is going to be put into much higher COVID restrictions, which is obviously going to have a big impact on people generally. But Amy, you've been looking at what this means for schools and specifically policies on mask wearing. And I believe it's been harder to find out exactly what that does mean than you might expect. Do you want to tell us about that?
Sure. So it was a bit of a challenge, I have to admit, trying to find out exactly how the various different frameworks work together. So what we knew is that there is one new framework, this 3-tiered framework that the government is using to kind of impose local restrictions to different extents. So you've got the medium, high and high risk areas, and they've all got slightly different rules. And then you've separately got this education framework, which is helpfully 4 tiers, and also up until this point we understood that to be separate to the government's new tiered system. So we've got these 2 frameworks which we didn't think were supposed to, or had been told didn't overlap. But what we were able to establish is that they do influence one another, because obviously in order to kind of understand how local restrictions are implied in one framework, you need to understand how they're sort of defined in the other one. It's all a bit confusing. John did a story about how ASCL leader Jeff Barton said that it is baffling for schools, this setup, and you can see why, because there's a lot of it's complicated enough as it is dealing with coronavirus, so then to have these 2 separate systems as well is very confusing. So it was, confusing for us, and we're following this policy all the time. So yes, we've got these 2 systems, and what we managed to get the DfE to clarify is that areas which are in tiers 2 or 3 of the government's new COVID alert system, so those are the 2 tiers with the more severe restrictions, fall under tier 1 of the school system. And what tier 1 of the school system says is that secondary staff and pupils should wear masks in communal areas. So essentially, any schools that were moving into tier 2 of the government system, not very many areas are in tier 3 at the moment. So those moving into tier 2 and 3 would need to make masks mandatory in their communal areas, which affected a lot of schools, as it turned out. We know obviously London, Essex and York are among the areas that are moving into tier 2 this weekend. So from Monday, we're looking at an awful lot more secondaries having to require masks. And I think one of the lessons learned was just that these policies were not, or perhaps even if they were aligned, it wasn't clear in which ways they were aligned, and it took quite a lot of digging to actually find that out. And I imagine it was, but for some schools, as I was seeing reported on social media, a bit frustrating to try and figure out where they stood in all of this. So that was the first story that we did on masks.
Yeah, it was a great story, I think, for 2 reasons. One, because it obviously, well, judging by the response and how hard it was to get there, I don't know if schools have actually specifically been told this, or schools know they were. So I think it was an important bit of kind of public information. But yeah, I thought it was fascinating, the fact that the DfE themselves didn't seem to realise how the 2 interacted. And as has been said before, if the government can't understand it, then what chances has anybody else got?
Yeah, and I think, sorry, I'm just jumping into a different story, but we've had a couple recently about how the DfE and Number 10 are kind of not necessarily completely aligned on their policies, or one is being dictated by the other, most likely Number 10 dictated to the DfE. So I wonder if it's got something to do with that. We've got the new government tiers on the one hand, and perhaps that hadn't yet been fully aligned with the education tiers, which the DfE had set out. Was it in August? It was a while ago now. So yeah, really confusing stuff. that fried my brain a bit doing the research.
Yeah, I mean, well, from our point of view, I think the other good thing, but it just showed how useful another one of our exclusives, which I think we should now talk about, was which was again about masks, but that looked at how, not what's going to happen, but what has been happening, about how schools that have had mandatory mask policies, how they've actually operated. I think that's an important thing actually just to mention here, because we said in our stories, you know, hundreds more schools will now have to make masks compulsory, but it's been optional for a lot of them up to now, hasn't it? So some of them will, some of them won't. And we've done, sorry, you should be talking about this, Amy, but we've done a very big survey which has asked the schools that did opt to make masks mandatory, our staff there, how that's been going. What did we find out?
Well, not brilliantly, or perhaps it's not necessarily being enforced particularly strongly. So what we found out is that 61% of staff in schools that demand pupils wear face masks said nothing happens when they break the rule. So essentially it means that for a lot of students there aren't any consequences of not following the school's policy on masks, which I think is tricky. I mean, there are some options, and obviously some schools, just looking at the percentages now, I think 29% of staff said that the children would receive some other sanction, like a detention, if they didn't wear them. But it is tricky because, as I've said, you know, schools are having to manage so many different COVID measures, then to be dishing out punishments as well for people who aren't complying with the rules, especially if they, you know, they might have their own views and reasons for not doing that, must be quite challenging. I think that's essentially what we've shown. You know, there aren't any consequences for them. And the schools also have really varying, separately, we also asked about schools outside of lockdown areas who, you know, have the option to make masks mandatory and to dictate their own policies. And there are some really varying policies out there, both from a pupil's point of view, so how pupils are expected, or when pupils are expected to wear them, and staff too. And actually, we found out that I think it was 2% of pupils, but I'm just going to double check the numbers, were expected to wear them in lessons, which was quite, it was 1% said students must wear masks in lessons. And I think the percentage was slightly higher for staff, 4% had to wear them in lessons. So actually some are going further, we can see, than what the government has said should be mandatory, which is interesting. And I also saw some people commenting on my article on social media yesterday saying that they too thought that masks should be mandatory in lessons. So different perspectives on what's necessary, but what we can see is that those that have made masks mandatory aren't necessarily dishing out consequences if the students aren't complying with that.
So just to come back to that original point, so we found that 60% of the teaching staff we asked said nothing was being done. What about the rest of them?
So looking at the graph now, so 29% said there'd be some other sanction, for example, detention. 2% said the students would be taught in an isolated part of the site. I imagine that would be quite tricky, given that they're having to spread them out quite a lot already. And 8% said they'd be sent home, which we know the government is saying, I believe the government is saying that shouldn't happen.
Shouldn't happen, yeah.
Yeah, so interesting.
Yeah, and really, really, really tricky for schools. So we've also been looking at, it's obviously not just behaviour and issues like masks and even academic achievement. You know, there's been, I think a lot of what's come out about COVID has been how unequal the impact has been. So if Dave was here, he could tell us all about this, because this is a superb story that he's done together with our other deputy news editor, Charlotte Santry. But Mary Louise is going to talk about this. This is a story where we've looked in, as actually Robert Halfon, the chair of the Education Select Committee, kindly said for us on social media. It's absolutely right. We've done the work that the DFE should have done. When they were producing attendance figures for over when schools were open, partially open during lockdown, it emerged that there were no attendance figures for free school meal pupils. So we've done the work for them, which Mary Louise can tell us all about, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you say, well, the context of this was back in July when we were looking into the national tutoring programme and other money that was had been announced for to help disadvantaged pupils catch up. We said, well, how's that going to be allocated? And the DfE said they actually didn't know how many disadvantaged pupils had attended. So my colleagues, as you say, Dave and Charlotte, decided to find out for themselves and got hold of, using the Freedom of Information request, got hold of attendance data by school from a specific week from the 25th of June to 2nd of July during the lockdown period, and it was also during the period when years 1, 6 and reception had been invited back into school, and they then looked at the proportion of students on pupils on free school meals and compared that to get a picture of attendance during that period. And what they found was that the schools in the top 10 most deprived areas, primary schools this is, had roughly around half that of the top 10% of schools in the most advantaged areas.
Half the attendance.
Yes. Yeah. So it showed that obviously that schools in most deprived areas were worst hit in terms of pupils not attending, and what we've seen is when pupils weren't attending school, that a lot of them weren't engaging with any kind of learning remotely. So this obviously raises lots of questions, as you said. Well, I've got the quote here from the Commons Education Select Committee Chair Robert Halfon, who said, "Thank you for doing the number crunching. DfE should have been doing themselves." And he's called for them to react accordingly and set out a strategy of what they're going to do to help, a proper strategy of what they're going to do to help these pupils catch up. I think he actually described our colleagues Dave and Charlotte as informally as genius for putting these figures together, which is good to hear. Yeah, high praise. And yeah, so I mean that's the main summary of that story, but huge implications.
Yeah, well, I was just going to, you may have touched on this, but one of the things I noticed is it said this is going to be putting, hugely increased pressure on teachers in those areas. Is that because essentially they've got more work to do now to help those pupils catch up?
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. And head teachers have said, the starting point of this story, how could the DfE know how much catch-up funding is needed if they haven't done this basic analysis, if they're focusing that money or a good proportion of that money on disadvantaged pupils and they haven't done this work? Kind of how are they targeting it, and how do they know how much is needed?
I think that's a crucial point as well. And that's what's something about the story is that it does quantify this, because there's been most of the reaction has been really good, but a couple of people reacted again on social media, but saying, because we build the stories, it shows how lockdown hits schools serving the poorest twice as hard. And people have gone, well, that's not a story, tell us something new. And in a way that is the case, but I think if you're bothered about this and you want something done about it, then getting the data and working out exactly how much is just really important in doing that. And I think that was the weakness of where the DfE was. So I think Dave and Charlotte have done an amazing job in doing that. As I say, really proud of that. Last in our clutch of investigations today, we've got another one from Amy, who's done some amazing work in smoking out the DfE's suspicious reluctance to say whether or not it will honour its pledge to spend another 143 million on catch-up tutoring this academic year, again, obviously for COVID. So tell us about what you found out about the missing millions, Amy.
Sure. So this was a really interesting one to research. So essentially, the way we got there is we looked at what money had been assigned so far to the various different elements of the National Tutoring Programme, which in itself is quite complicated. and also includes a couple of other funds and investments which aren't strictly related necessarily to what people might have thought they would be to begin with, which is, you know, this tutoring in schools. So one of the biggest portions of the funding, which I think is about £96 million, is going towards a 16 to 19 fund, which is really important, but isn't going to be kind of in the classrooms up to 16. And then there's a further £9 million going towards this reception year early language programme. So those are both technically part of the NPP. So we took those aside out of the 350 million that was assigned to the programme, and we looked at what was left. And what we could work out was that actually one strand of the remaining part, which is to do with subsidised tutoring, so schools can access tutoring through approved partners, and that will be subsidised by the DfE, that's worth about £76 million. And then separately, Teach First is recruiting and training up these academic mentors who will go into schools and help out in disadvantaged areas. And that strand was worth just over 25 million. So actually, you're left with a huge portion of money, about 143 million we worked out, which is just unaccounted for. We didn't know, you know, where it was being spent, where it might be spent. So I asked the DfE that, and actually they wouldn't tell us. So what they did say is that our breakdown was broadly correct, which was encouraging. So we knew we were on the right track. But actually, further information on the programmes would be set out following the government's spending review, which actually looks at budgets for 2021. So this is the financial year. This is where it gets a bit complicated again. 2021-22, 23-24. So we know there could potentially be more spending set out following that review, which would cover this year, so this academic year when it was supposed to be spent. But we don't know how much, we don't know what it will be spent on, and we won't know until that spending review is concluded. So it raised all sorts of questions about whether the government will be able to deliver on its pledge to deliver the whole fund, 350 million, in the academic year, at the end of August, I suppose, 2021. It's really interesting.
It's as clear as mud, isn't it? Which does make you think that might be a bit deliberate, how unclear it is. I mean, it sounds what they're saying that it will be come out in that CSR, but they didn't even definitely say that, did they? I mean, they said
no.
They'll tell us where the rest of it after that's been announced. So
yeah, exactly. So they said, sorry, carry on.
Go on. So it's your story. Go
on. They're enthusiastic about it. So they said basically that they would set out further details after the spending review, and then we went back to them and said, all right then, so does that mean the 143 million that we've identified will be set out as part of the spending review? You know, you'll tell us exactly how that will be spent. And they just repeated what they'd said before. So we didn't have confirmation that exactly that amount of money would be accounted for in the spending review, which is, again, as you say, kind of clear as mud. It might be, but I'm not clear on whether that's even been decided yet. So yeah, and heads, I mean, we spoke to Jeff Barton, who's head of the ASCL union, head teachers union, and he actually said something which is troubling, and that there's a real danger, he said, that the benefit of the fund will be lost the longer it takes to turn it into tangible support. So if we keep kicking the can down, well, not we, if the government keeps kicking the can down the road, and the fund doesn't materialise either this academic year or whenever, you know, we're looking at actually diminishing in value, which is the last thing we want, because this is such an urgent and pressing issue.
What do you mean?
Yeah.
You mean financially, or just because?
I don't mean financial value. No, I think so. What Jeff was saying is the benefit of the fund will be lost, or there's a danger the benefit of the fund will be lost the longer it takes to turn it into tangible support. So I mean,
there'll be so much more to do because pupils will be more behind. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, because the problem wouldn't be addressed at the point of need, you know, as early on as he would like it to be. And I suppose these things will only be compounded the more kind of pupils fall behind in the year ahead. So they're certainly concerned about that. I mean, we'll see. Maybe it will be set out, you know, crystal clear after the spending review.
I was just thinking about this. You would think that if it was going to be, they'd say, wouldn't they? Do you know?
I wonder if they don't know.
Maybe.
Well, now they've got our analysis. on which schools and which areas have been the hardest hit. They can allocate they can decide where to send that money and target that money maybe.
Good. Job done.
Yeah, sorry. So in a slightly contrived link, obviously not just teachers, tutors that are going to be having to help with the catch up. It's teachers too, and they've been obviously teachers, but they've been having to make a difference, which has been particularly hard when schools close, because they've obviously having to do remote teaching. And John, they were given a reminder of just what a challenge that was this week, weren't they? At an event that you covered.
So, sorry.
TikTok.
Oh, sorry, of course. How can I forget this? So yeah, amongst all the important investigations we've done this week, I've been writing about cats on TikTok. So Matt Hood, who's the head of Oak National Academy, gave a presentation to Schools North East leaders in the North about what they've been doing since they launched their online platform. And he was asked about how what they've learned might feed into teacher training. And what he said was that they found that teachers have to be more engaging. And he described himself as having a Blue Peter style, and saying that works better in online and remote lessons, and that they need to project their enthusiasm down the line. They need to be crisp and concise, because if they don't, in his words, there is a cat dancing on TikTok and kids will go and look at that instead. Which does kind of prove quite provocative on social media. Some people quite kind of angered at the observation. But he also said something I thought was really interesting, which is that they need to build in more pause points in these lessons, doing it this way. They need every couple of minutes to stop and let the kids digest in a way that's different to classroom teaching. And I suppose it reinforces the point that these are two very different things. And the cat on TikTok thing is obviously kind of a throwaway line, but he has the point. It points to an important thing, I think, that teaching in a classroom and trying to project a lesson over the internet are two different things. And it's interesting that was one of their key findings.
What was the kind of angry reaction about? What wound people up about that?
I think some people thought it was kind of perhaps didn't sort of see the context in which it was said, and thought it was somehow dismissive about remote learning and about the importance of it, to try and almost suggest that it's being done in competition with short music clips on TikTok. I'm trying to pretend that I know what TikTok is.
I love TikTok.
Amazing and incredibly addictive, so I do know it.
I mean, it's so distracting. I totally get that.
Yeah, I mean, but it's, in lockdown, I think it's a fair point to make that, children's attention span is not the same. I know this from my own utterly failed attempt to do homeschool. Is not the same as it might be in a classroom. And so if the kind of Oak format is going to become more and more important as we go potentially into lockdowns or circuit breakers or whatever, I think it's really interesting to sort of see how it changes teaching. The question he didn't really answer was that how much will it influence teacher training? How much, I suppose in a sense, how much of this kind of new normal, to use that horrible phrase, is going to kind of impact on teaching long term? And I suppose as well, how long is COVID disruption going to last? And so how long would schools have to think about this sort of stuff? But it was really, really interesting. The other thing he said that I thought was quite interesting was just the link they found between people who are using Oak and COVID in their area. I mean, it's obvious, I suppose, that's what it's there for. But they kind of showed a correlation directly in places in the Northwest where there's been very high COVID cases. There's a direct correlation with more kids going online to use Oak's lessons.
Which I guess is no surprise, but interesting. Should we have a quick explanation of TikTok for? I'm sure there's many out. If John doesn't, there's many more people out there who share that.
TikTok.
Amy, explain it to us.
Oh, how do you sum it up? I've only ever made one TikTok video, and it's of my parents dancing. So I don't have a whole lot of experience of creating videos, but it's basically it's a social media-ish network. It's not the kind of network where you share sort of, you might do, but updates on your life in text form or anything. It's all little video clips, and they have a time limit on them. I can't remember exactly what it is. And what I think is the cleverest thing about TikTok is essentially you scroll through it and you can just watch these videos created by anybody anywhere in the world. But it can tell, I mean, I don't know how, which things you're interested in. based on how long you spend watching those videos, I think. And so it has this amazing algorithm which then kind of curates stuff for you. So whenever you go on there, everything you see you like, because it knows from videos you've seen before what you're interested in. Does that make sense?
It does.
So
Yeah,
that's why it's addictive.
It is scarily accurate, I think.
I think
I've made 3 TikTok videos, by the way.
Oh, more than me then. Basically a creator.
Various things with my sausage dog doing silly things. It's compelling viewing.
I was going to say, I just think it shows what, you know, rather than that demeaning the idea of remote teaching. I think it's just an illustration of what a challenge it is, how hard it's got to be, because you have got to compete against those kind of things going on at home. So which brings me on to, and finally, John, for teachers that might need a morale boost for all that remote learning, you heard some tips on that. What could be done to improve people's moods during times of cold classrooms and increasing lockdown?
Yeah, so this is another thing that came out of the Schools Northeast conference. They were asked, a panel of leaders were asked, well, exactly that. How are they? What little tips can they share for coping with the restrictions and keeping morale up? And one head teacher of a primary school in Hartlepool in the Northeast said that their teachers can't go to the staff room anymore, and they're all in cold ventilated classrooms. And their solution, it's kind of an obvious one really, but it kind of got a lot of traction, is a tea trolley trundling along the corridor from class to class, giving them a hot drink, and kind of making them connected with the rest of the school. And he said it's had a big impact on morale, and they're so pleased with it. They're thinking of extending it to delivering hot soup to the kids when it gets colder. I can't decide if that's kind of uplifting or bleak really, but it was that was one really interesting one. A kind of a more newsy one, I suppose, or hard news thing is a couple of the school leaders there said that they've used COVID and the kind of situation that they're in to reassess how they performance manage, and basically ditching performance related pay, decoupling performance management and pay. And that again got a lot of traction. And yeah, it's interesting that obviously that's not kind of directly related to COVID, but just because it's such an extraordinary time, I think it's getting schools to think about everything that they do and what do we need and what can we ditch. And yeah, I think if that was ditched across the board, that would probably be as popular as a tea trolley as well.
Drinks trolley would be good though. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I might have a word with my boyfriend and see if we can introduce the tea trolley in our flat.
That's a great idea. Right, let's end on that uplifting moment then. I think an amazing set of stories. You can read them all on our website. So look forward to that. And sure Dave will be back next week. Thanks a lot. Bye everyone.
Thanks,
Bye.
bye.
Bye.